Welcome to the webinar series, Introduction to Curriculum Development and Medical Education Scholarship for Resident Trainees. This is webinar 6. This webinar will cover Kern Step 6, Evaluation and Scholarship. The goal of webinar 6 is that learners will understand how to assess the achievement of learning objectives in a curriculum and be familiar with opportunities for scholarship in medical education. The objectives for webinar 6 are that by the end of this webinar, learners will be able to, number 1, define and contrast assessment and evaluation, number 2, name Glassix criteria for scholarship, number 3, describe common study designs and evaluation methods, number 4, describe common formats for dissemination and scholarship in medical education. Webinar 6, our final webinar, rounds out the discussion that we have been having about the Kern 6 steps of curriculum development. Today we will talk about Kern Step 6, Evaluation and Feedback, and Scholarship. Some of this material was covered as a preview in Webinar 1, but will be covered more fully during today's discussion. Throughout the webinar series, we have occasionally referred to both assessment and evaluation. Though these two terms are related, they technically have different meanings. Assessment is typically used to refer to measurements of an individual student or learner. Evaluation is defined as the identification, clarification, and application of criteria to determine the merit or worth of what is being evaluated. It typically refers to a program. Evaluation is considered an appraisal or judgment, where the goals and the objectives of the curriculum met, and it closes the loop in the curriculum development cycle. Assessments of your learner are part of the evaluation of your curriculum, but remember, assessments are of a learner, evaluation is of a curriculum. In considering how best to evaluate your curriculum, one common set of criteria are the Glassix criteria for scholarship. These criteria refer to how we judge if work done in an educational domain is suitable to be considered scholarship. These criteria are clear goals, adequate preparation, appropriate methods, significant results, effective presentation, and reflective critique. Though not specifically part of the Kern 6 steps, many of the Glassix criteria are reminiscent of parts of Kern that we have already discussed and will discuss again today, and we will go through them in detail when discussing how to approach evaluation of your curriculum. The first Glassix criteria to consider is clear goals of your scholarly project. This should sound familiar and be a bit of a review, as we have discussed this already in Webinar 1 when we introduced FINER as a mnemonic for evaluating your scholarly question. As a reminder, FINER stands for feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. When your curriculum has been planned and implemented to some degree, and evaluation is the next step, use FINER again to critically examine your scholarly question and identify any areas that need work or refinement. The majority of problems in medical education projects are under feasible. They are too broad, not enough subjects, too expensive, or take too much time. So now is another opportunity to be certain that your scholarly question is able to be answered by the curriculum or project that you have planned. The next Glassix criteria is adequate preparation. Have you shown that you understand the state of the field and existing scholarship that is relevant to your project? This step also harkens back to many of the materials we covered in the first few webinars covering Kern Step 1 and 2. Much of your preparation should have hopefully been done during your general needs assessment and literature search. Additionally, you will have already established the need for your project or curriculum, the so what or who cares. Remember also when you created your goals and objectives that your objectives were created by keeping in mind the specific measurable question that you wanted to return to later, which is now. Recall for objectives the framework of the 4 basic key elements: who will do, how much or how well, of what, by when. Well-written, measurable objectives prepare you for creating your evaluation when you finally want to measure something. The third Glassix criteria is appropriate methods. Again, this step will be some review and some new information, beginning with a quick review of our evaluation pyramids, Miller and Kirkpatrick. Recall again from Webinar 1, we first introduced our 2 evaluation frameworks, the Miller and Kirkpatrick model. As we discussed previously, evaluation frameworks help you think about the outcomes that you want to achieve, and by considering those outcomes, can help you select the best study design and methods to get at these outcomes. Recall that Miller's pyramid of clinical competence is for an individual learner progressing through a curriculum. We are assessing the learner. The levels of Miller are attainment of knowledge, knows, competence or application of knowledge, knows how, performance or skills demonstration, shows, and action or practice, does. Remember, you may not get to does in your first project or first year, but it is something to aspire to when considering assessment of your learner. Remember then that our second framework is the Kirkpatrick model of training program evaluation. We are evaluating the program or curriculum. The bottom level is evaluation of reaction, which is typically satisfaction or happiness. The next level is evaluation of learning. Did knowledge or skills transfer to the learner? The third level is evaluation of behavior. Did knowledge transfer? And finally, the top level is evaluation of results. Did the curriculum change patient care, or did you have an impact on society? Again, it takes a long time to get to the top of the pyramid and can be difficult to achieve, but it should be a goal of your curriculum to get there eventually. Study design is another important consideration when you are thinking about appropriate methods for evaluating your curriculum. Most study designs for medical education projects tend to be observational. Some study designs are post-test only, meaning you give an intervention, your curriculum or your program, or X in the diagram, and then you measure your outcomes, O in the diagram. If you only give your intervention or curriculum to one group, the design is post-test only. Give X, measure O. You can measure what learners have achieved after their curriculum, but those skills, knowledge, or attitude might have been present before the curriculum, or occurred from natural maturation, or picked up from other learning or interventions. It's difficult to make a definitive conclusion about demonstrating any change in your learners with a post-test only design, but often is a good place to start if you are simply piloting a new curriculum or soliciting feedback or satisfaction. If you are able to add a control group to your post-test only design, you can add a little bit more rigor to your design. The control group is measured on the same outcomes, O, but doesn't receive the intervention, X. The control group may receive nothing, but more commonly, they receive a standard curriculum or whatever is already in place. Having a controlled post-test design helps to rule out the maturation effect, or the concern that the learners achieve their new outcomes simply by progressing with their education overall, as both the intervention and the control will be progressing at the same rate. Perhaps the most common study design in educational projects is the pre-post test. Here, the learners are measured before the intervention, at time 01, receive the intervention, X, then the same group is measured again after the intervention at time 02. Here we have a little more information about how your learners changed after the curriculum, because we know how the learners performed before the intervention. But there are still concerns with this study design that perhaps the learners were just getting better over time with accumulating experience. Again, adding a control group helps to add a little bit more rigor to your design and increase the strength of your conclusions about the effect of your curriculum. Control groups can either be concurrent or historical. Take, for example, a curriculum you may be planning on how to insert an NG tube. An example of a concurrent control group would be a new curriculum where it is rolled out to a group of third-year medical students in the first and third quarters, but not the second and fourth. An NG tube insertion skills could be compared between the first and third quarter groups and the second and fourth quarter groups. On the other hand, a historical control group is a group that is similar to your intervention group, but did not receive your curriculum in the past. For example, if you study your third-year medical students before and after they receive your NG tube insertion curriculum, which you have just piloted this year, perhaps an appropriate historical control group would be a group of fourth-year students who did not receive your curriculum, but who have already progressed through the third year. If you are trying to assess if your specific NG tube curriculum improves NG tube insertion skills, you may worry that simply progressing through the third year of medical school itself would improve these skills, as the students get more opportunities to put in an NG, which you would reasonably expect that they would. If that were the case, maybe those third-year students would have answers similar to the fourth-year students if simply being a third year meant that your NG tube insertion skills would improve. However, if your curriculum works well, those third-year students who completed your curriculum would do even better than the fourth-year students who serve as your historical control. As a side note, it's possible even that those fourth-year students could have served as your needs assessment. If you plan your curriculum very carefully and select your groups well, you can ask the same question for your needs assessment as well as your evaluation, and use the answers as your historical control. Now that we have discussed how to design an evaluation study, let's spend a little more time discussing evaluation methods. How exactly will you be scoring your students, and with what tools? There are a variety of different types of evaluation methods to choose from, but it's key at this point to choose a measurement method that is feasible and available for your project and congruent with the objective you are trying to measure. For example, written tests for knowledge, direct observations for skills. Here we call back again to the Miller and Kirkpatrick models that we have been discussing at length. When you carefully plan and map your outcome using these models, the evaluation method is often much easier to select. And often, if there are several different levels or outcomes that you want to look at, you may use multiple methods in your evaluation. This table from Kern lists some of the most common types of methods that are used to evaluate a curriculum. All methods have pros and cons and limitations associated with each one. Rating forms or surveys are easy to use for most types of evaluation, but are subject to differences in reliability and rater biases. Self-assessment forms in which the learner rates him or herself are also easy to use and often helpful for formative evaluation, but there may be significant discrepancies in how a learner rates him or herself and the objective measurements of performance or knowledge. Written tests are often a tried and true method of assessment, especially of knowledge, but may be time-intensive to construct if a test does not already exist. And finally, direct observation and performance audits are key ways of getting at skills in clinical performance, but are time and personnel intensive and may require specific access to the learners or records that may not be feasible for a project. When you are considering what kinds of evaluation tools you want to use for your project or curriculum, it's important here, as it was in your needs assessment, to have a good grasp of the literature and really understand what is out there and what tools may exist already. If there is an existing tool, you may want to use it or modify it. If nothing exists that measures the objective you are interested in, you may need to create your own, which could be a project in and of itself. It may not be validated, but if nothing else exists, this is an acceptable limitation. When you are selecting your methods and tools, another very important thing to consider is what question is your primary outcome. If your curriculum works, what will be changed? It's easiest to demonstrate a change if you select a question that will be low at baseline. If you have a tool or survey that has 15 questions, you may only need 1 or 2 questions to get at your primary outcome. Is it a preparedness question? For example, how prepared do you feel to insert an NG tube? Or a knowledge-based question. For example, what is the most common complication of NG tube insertion? It's important here to think very carefully about the main message of your curriculum and choose your questions wisely. A quick note here on surveys, which are one of the most common evaluation methods. Many surveys use Likert-type questions, which typically measure your question or statement on a 1 to 5 scale. Likert-type questions often match well with the objectives that you have already written for your curriculum. If, for example, an objective that you wrote for the NG tube insertion curriculum was that, after the curriculum, 80% of students will feel more prepared to insert an NG tube. The matching Likert scale question may be, how prepared are you to insert an NG tube for a patient? Very prepared, prepared, neutral, unprepared, very unprepared. Remember also that survey fatigue is a very real thing, and so it often behooves you to make sure your questions are the most carefully selected and best questions to measure the change you are hoping your curriculum can make. To recap the first section of Webinar 6, we have introduced GLASSIC's 6 criteria for scholarship and gone through the first 3 GLASSIC criteria. The first 2, clear goals and adequate preparation, have allowed us to review the finer criteria for scholarly goals and the Miller and Kirkpatrick evaluation pyramids as frameworks for evaluation. And finally, the third GLASSIC criteria, appropriate methods, has allowed us to discuss some common evaluation study designs and methods. Continuing along in our discussion of GLASSIC's criteria for scholarship, the fourth criteria is significant results. Analyzing your results can be very simple or very complex depending on what kind of evaluation methods you use and the resources your project has. It is beyond the scope of our webinar series here to discuss data analysis in great detail, but most evaluations do require at least some basic statistical knowledge to describe the results. In a survey, for example, the most common reported results may be a response rate, usually reported as a percentage, and then descriptive statistics to describe the data. Returning again to our example of an NG tube insertion curriculum, if we are analyzing our prepared to put in an NG tube Likert question, we can describe our data by reporting a percentage. Perhaps 90% of students taking your curriculum marked that they were prepared or very prepared to insert an NG tube in your post-survey. Depending on what kinds of variables you are analyzing, there are a few different types of tests that are very commonly used and worth mentioning briefly here. These tests apply when you are trying to compare something, such as scores before and after in a pre-post study design. A continuous variable, such as a test score, can be analyzed using a t-test, which compares the means and standard deviations of 2 groups, usually pre and post. A binary variable, such as yes or no, agree or disagree, can be analyzed using a chi-square analysis, which compares percentages. A Likert scale type question is often analyzed using a Wilcoxon rank sum test, which looks at the distribution of answers on a Likert scale, adds up all the numbers, 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s, and compares the distributions before and after. After you have chosen your evaluation study design, collected your data using your carefully chosen methods, and done a proper data analysis, the next step is effective presentation and dissemination. There are many different opportunities for scholarship and publication in medical education, and the first step is usually not writing a manuscript. When considering how you want to present your results and share your curriculum, think first of who your target audience is. Who do you want to know about your project? Is it program directors, medical school deans, fellow residents? Is there a meeting or journal that is specific to this audience? Is there a relevant online repository of curriculum materials that may be applicable? Can you submit an abstract or a poster, a workshop? Is there an institutional opportunity to showcase your work? Or is there a local or regional chapter of a national organization? There are many options to explore before jumping to a manuscript, but if and when a manuscript is appropriate, it's important to select the proper journal for your submission, and this is something your mentor should advise and assist you with. The final criteria that we will discuss today is Glassex's criteria number 6, reflective critique. Reflective critique refers to the process of critically evaluating your work on your project or curriculum and using your evaluation to improve the quality of future work. What went well? What didn't go well? Are there areas you wish you could have done differently? If this is a pilot project, how might you extend your curriculum or project in its next phase? From a long-term viewpoint, how did this project affect your career goals and experience, your goals and experience as a medical educator? Here we will do a short exercise in applying the material we have discussed in Webinar 6. Consider the example of Frank, who is working on an evaluation strategy for a curriculum that he has put in place for third-year medical students in their general surgery clerkship. The goal of Frank's curriculum is to improve MS3 phlebotomy skills. The curriculum has included one lecture on peripheral vein anatomy, a shadowing experience with phlebotomists in the hospital, and a workshop on phlebotomy on a simulated model. Frank is now pondering how best to measure the effect that his curriculum had on his learners and is considering several strategies. Please turn to your Part 1 discussion sheet and pause the webinar after listening to these instructions. Please reflect on the following questions. What evaluation study design would you suggest for evaluation of each of the different aspects of Frank's curriculum? What would be the best method to evaluate each component of Frank's phlebotomy curriculum? Please select the most appropriate method for the number 1, peripheral anatomy lecture, number 2, shadowing experience, and number 3, simulation workshop. What kind of evaluation method would be necessary to fulfill the program evaluation of Frank's phlebotomy curriculum at Kirkpatrick's top level, evaluation of results, or transfer of impact to society? Pause the webinar to complete these sections on your discussion sheet. When you have completed these exercises, please continue in the webinar. To recap the second section of Webinar 6, we have discussed Glassix criteria number 4, 5, and 6. We discussed a basic approach to data analysis and the importance of significant results and choosing statistical tests wisely. We discussed considerations for dissemination of your work and the importance of reflection on and critique of your project. And finally, we briefly discussed some opportunities for dissemination in medical education beyond simply a journal article. After you have reflected on Part 1 and received feedback on your answers, please now think about your own scholarly project in medical education. What is the ideal study design that you would like to implement in order to evaluate your project? What kinds of resources will you need to design this type of evaluation? What evaluation methods do you anticipate using? What levels of the Miller or Kirkpatrick models correspond with your chosen methods? How can you apply reflective critique to your project thus far? What is going well? What is not going well? Reflect on any potential changes or alterations you may want to consider for the future. Please consider how these areas that we have covered in Webinar 6 may apply to your project, and review these parts of the webinar if necessary. Using the feedback that you have received in Part 1, please complete the Part 2 discussion sheet to answer these questions for your own scholarly project. This concludes Webinar 6 of the series, Introduction to Curriculum Development and Medical Education Scholarship for Resident Trainees. This concludes the webinar series.